The High Court will hear a legal challenge in the first week of September to decide whether the government's postal vote on marriage equality can go ahead. Ballot papers are set to hit mailboxes around the country from September the 12th, but the Turnbull government's $122 million plebiscite is still anything but certain. Professor Sarah Joseph is the director of the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law at Monash Law School. Welcome,
Thanks,
Sarah.
James.
Thank you. Now, we'll get on to the High Court challenge in a moment, but first of all, we're speaking on quite an important anniversary date, August 16th. Can you explain why that's so important?
It's 40 years since Elvis died. It's true. And it's also Madonna's birthday. But I think what you might be referring to is that in 2003, or I'm afraid it might have been 2004, that is the date that the Howard government amended the Marriage Act and made it explicit that marriage was between a man and a woman. Before that amendment, it did not specify between a man and a woman, and amazingly that amendment went through Parliament without any sort of plebiscite.
Was there any fanfare at the time about this, do you remember, or did it kind of just sail through?
It certainly sailed through Parliament, and I can't remember a lot of media commentary of course that's in a time when there was no social media, so there was nothing like the type of commentary you get now, but it wasn't, I'm sure there was some discussion outside Parliament, but it wasn't particularly controversial within Parliament, and so no, I don't recall a lot of discussion at the time.
Since that time, which is 13 years ago now, the push for marriage equality has taken all forms, and as is the way that successive governments have approached the issue, both Labor and Liberal.
And overseas.
Absolutely.
Which is also very important. I mean, Australia is now, very much behind a lot of the countries that we believe ourselves to be like.
Absolutely. And I guess some of those countries are completely unexpected. Recently, Taiwan, I believe, made marriage equality legal as well. From a legal perspective, I mean, we look at the promise of the Turnbull government at the last election to have a popular vote on marriage equality, and that has been their reasoning for sticking to that. How did that stack up from a legal perspective?
Well, I might talk about the legal perspective a little bit later. I mean, I think I'd rather talk from a more basic idea of, is this a good idea? It seems like this idea of a plebiscite. The idea of a plebiscite followed from Ireland's constitutional referendum. In order for Ireland to legalise marriage equality, it actually had to change its constitution. So the only way that could possibly happen was through an actual referendum. And then when that passed, I recall there was a discussion in the party room, which was under Tony Abbott's prime ministership, and suddenly this idea arose that Australia should have a plebiscite. But the thing is that in Australia we don't need constitutional reform in order to do this. We just need an ordinary vote in Parliament, just like we had 13 years ago. And so it seemed to me at the time as a fairly clever delaying tactic, and I think that is what it's been turned into. From a legal point of view, I mean, I get the idea that the Turnbull government is saying that it has to stick to its promise. A lot of electoral promises are broken, and there's not often litigation or legal consequences which follow. So, the idea that someone could, seek an injunction to prevent, to insist on a plebiscite is absurd. So it is a bit, it is quite suspicious to me as to why this particular promise has to be kept when many other promises from both sides of politics are unfortunately routinely broken. It seems to me this plebiscite is necessary in order to really keep the government together, especially with such fine numbers in the House and the Senate. It does seem to be indicative of an intra-LNP war over this issue.
So the idea for this plebiscite morphed only just last week into, after a meeting of the coalition, into a postal vote.
Yeah.
$122 million postal vote. Was that a good idea?
Okay, well, the plebiscite they have now put up twice to the Senate, and it's been rejected both times, in order to have the compulsory plebiscite that they were, with all of the electoral laws surrounding it. In order to do that, they needed legislation, and they haven't been able to get it through Parliament.
Can you just sort of like distinguish the compulsory plebiscite from a postal vote?
Well, what is apparently going to happen now is that we're going to have a postal plebiscite. In fact, they're now dropping that word. It really is a postal survey, which is not compulsory. People can fill it out if they wish. They don't have to fill it out. I think rather worryingly, it's not going to have all of the protections which surround an actual electoral vote. A lot of the electoral law won't automatically apply, so security around the vote and so on will not be nearly as strong as it would have been. And obviously, I suppose there is a much greater scope for a lot of people to simply not vote, to either forget to vote or ultimately just not vote. So it's not going to be quite as much of a temperature gauge of what the Australian people really think.
And there's a fear as well that is observable amongst campaigners for marriage equality of a split where there's some people who are saying, well, I don't believe in this postal vote, and so I'll boycott it. And others saying, well, it's the only chance that we've got, so let's vote yes.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think there will be some people who are going to boycott. Former High Court Justice Michael Kirby has said he will boycott. Whether he does or not, who knows. Look, it's ultimately up to one's personal conscience if they want to boycott or not. And the argument for a boycott is people think that this is a fairly insulting process to insist that the majority has to approve of minority rights. And I have a lot of sympathy for that argument. I personally think that a boycott would be a strategic mistake. I think ultimately a no vote would be very bad for the marriage equality argument, because I think it would at the very least delay marriage equality until a Labor government came in. And a Labor government might come in next time or it might not, but I think a no vote would make it probably quite difficult for any LNP government in the near future to actually legislate. So, people have to make up their own minds, but I think a boycott would actually be quite strategically wrong. The other argument, I suppose, for a boycott is people are very worried about the debate which might ensue. And we've already seen some of that it's quite divisive, it's quite insulting. A lot of it is irrelevant. I mean, with what Tony Abbott's been talking about, it's all about free speech and political correctness. That's just simply not true. But the thing is, that rhetoric is going to happen regardless of a boycott. So I don't, ultimately a boycott to stop that rhetoric isn't really going to work.
And that's assuming that the vote actually goes ahead. There's this High Court challenge. We're going to hear from the High Court on September 5th and 6th, I believe. What's the basis of that High Court challenge? When it who's actually brought it and
yeah, look,
what's the constitutional basis?
Okay, it's a High Court challenge on the basis that this proposed postal survey is unconstitutional. Or there's two arguments. One is that it's unconstitutional, that the government needs legislative authority, so that is the authority of the Parliament, including the Senate, in order to spend lots of money. And as you mentioned before, it's going to spend $122 million on this postal plebiscite, and it doesn't have specific legislation which has authorised that. So that is one basis of the challenge, which I think is, look, there's not a lot to be gained by predictions, but I think that's a pretty strong argument that the Commonwealth, that the government simply lacks the constitutional power to spend money on this. And if it can't spend money on it, it really then would be an utter failure. The other argument is, interestingly, for something that is a vote. It's not being run through the Australian Electoral Commission, it's being run through the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which has a role in collecting statistics, running the census, or not running the census, or whatever it was they did last year, but, collecting statistics on whatever, and the relevant minister can direct the ABS to collect statistics. Whether a non-compulsory survey of what people think about marriage equality is in fact the collection of statistics, that's a pretty fancy statutory interpretation argument, but it shows you statutory interpretation can be exciting because that is another basis upon which the postal survey could fail.
So not at all to presuppose what the High Court will decide, but put your wig on and you're the Chief Justice. How do you think this one's going to go?
I don't like doing this, but I think the constitutional argument's pretty strong. Having just said that statutory interpretation is really exciting, it's not something it's not my strength. So I haven't thought a lot about the argument of
see a lot of banners for around.
I mean, I think it is.
Public.
Okay, it does seem to me to be a stretch to say this is somehow the collection of statistics. So I think the government could be in some trouble. I'd put maybe 55-45, which is a pretty weak prediction.
And what do you think? Apart from this particular decision, what's the way forward for marriage equality in Australia?
Look, I think it is inevitable. Australia, I mean, I mentioned before, Australia is really, lagging behind pretty much all other Western democracies on this issue. And I think, look, if the postal survey goes ahead and there is a yes vote, and that's what I actually predict would happen if it goes ahead, that ultimately there would be a yes vote. Apparently that's not going to be binding. I mean, in law it cannot be binding. And there is undoubtedly some people, probably in both parties, who would continue to vote no. But I think the majority in the parliament would then vote yes, and we'd have marriage equality by the end of the year. If there is a no vote, that will really extend the culture war, so that's why I think it would be a bit of a disaster for the issue. I do believe that the Labor Party, which has committed to dropping its conscience vote next time, which means it would be a party committed to marriage equality, if and when it wins an election, which it will one day, one would think, it will legislate for marriage equality. But if there is a no vote in the postal survey, that could make it very politically difficult for the LNP to ever instigate this issue. So I think it's inevitable, but and the postal survey at the moment is probably the quickest way there. But personally, I think it's unnecessary. I mean, I think Parliament should just do its job and vote.
Well, we'll watch with great interest, I'm sure, in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, thanks, James.
So, Sarah Joseph, Professor Sarah Joseph, the Director of the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law at Monash Law School. And if you want to have your say, you've got until the 24th of August. That's just over a week away to make sure that your details are up to date with the Australian Electoral Commission.
Yeah, that's very important. And 16 and 17-year-olds should also enrol because there is a question as to whether they are in fact allowed to vote in this survey. A lot of constitutional experts or statutory interpretation experts have read the guidelines so far, and they think that any 16 or 17-year-old who enrolls, look, Google this issue. It's obviously quite complicated, but if you're 16 and 17, enrol, and at the moment you'll probably get a vote, or you'll probably get surveyed.
There you go, you heard it first here at Monash Law School. So 16-year-olds onwards, if you have never voted before, if you've moved house recently, jump onto the AEC website and check your details.